Welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. This is the first episode in a series on what I am calling elemental etymology, which is essentially just the etymology of the elements that we see every day out in the world. Of course, they have a number of very interesting names, and in this series we're going to explore where some, or really most, of those names come from. In this episode, we're going to look at all of the first 25 elements. I thought we would just go through these one by one because honestly, these are some of the most common elements that occur out there in the world. Of course, they make up the constituents of who we are, so they are very important elements to know about. But the interesting thing about these first 25 elements is that they do come from a mix of etymological sources. In other words, there were a number of different rationales that went into why these elements got the names that they did. If we sort of break it down, just so you can see where we're going in this episode, first of all, we're going to talk about 8 of these 25 elements that were named for some kind of property that they had. Of course, that can be a number of different properties, as we are going to see. Now, the lion's share of these first 25 elements were not named for a specific property necessarily, but they were named for a well-known source or source compound that they were originally gotten from or isolated from, or in some cases just came from. So as we're going to see, as I said, most of these 25 were actually named for something, some famous thing or compound that they came from, because oftentimes the compounds were more famous in prior history than the elements were, and the elements had to be isolated from those more well-known compounds. As you can see, that's already 22 of the 25 elements here that kick off the periodic table. One of them was named for a region of origin, and then 2 of them were named for mythological figures. As you can see, if you do the math, that brings us up to 25 elements, and so all 25 of the first elements on the periodic table came from one of those 4 sources. So again, we're going to take these in order, so let's get started and look at the 8 that were named for some kind of property that they had. The first one is actually the very first element on the periodic table, and that is hydrogen. Now, where does the word hydrogen come from? A lot of these elements are going to be named from Greek words, and the reason is that a lot of these elements were named in the past couple hundred years when Greek especially was seen as an ancient classical language of learning and science. We get so many science and scientific related words from the Greek language. So when I say they're from Greek, that doesn't mean that the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, had these compounds. These are recent compounds that are made up of ancient Greek morphemes. And if you don't know what I mean when I say morpheme, a morpheme is a meaning-bearing unit of word. So for instance, like hydro. Hydro is a morpheme. It's not necessarily a whole word. It's a part of a word, but it means something. And in ancient Greek, hydro, which would have some kind of ending in ancient Greek usually, it meant water. So anything hydro is something water. The last part of it, gen, we pronounce it gen today, but in ancient Greek that would have been a hard G, so gen, that gen root that is found in ancient Greek, Latin, and a number of other languages means something about giving birth to. It can actually be active or passive in these compounds, so it can mean giving birth to something, or it can mean born from something. By the way, if this seems familiar and you've been following this channel for a while, you know that we have talked about this root already, so I'm going to put a link up here to an episode that talks about the gen root, because we have a lot of words in English today from the gen root, not just hydrogen. So what does the name hydrogen mean when we call this element hydrogen? Why was it given that name in the first place? Well, the interesting thing about hydrogen is that if you burn it, it combines with oxygen molecules, and you probably know what happens when you put 2 hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom together. You get a water molecule, all right? So when you burn hydrogen, it creates water, it gives birth to water, and that's actually all that the word hydrogen means. It means water bearing. It means giving birth to water. That's essentially how hydrogen got its name. Now, we're going to see with really most of these elements that the name isn't necessarily sufficient for talking about everything that it can do. We know that hydrogen is an extremely common element in the universe because it's the simplest element that we have on the periodic table. And so it does a lot more than just give birth to water when it gets burned. But that particular property of hydrogen is the one that stuck out to those early researchers that named it this a couple 100 years ago. What other elements were named for some particular property? What about fluorine? Fluorine comes from the Latin root fluor, which means to flow. It actually looks a lot like our word flow, as you can see. Now, why would this element be called the flowing element? That doesn't necessarily make sense until you realize what it was originally used for. One of the early uses that people, scientists, used it for. It was oftentimes added to compounds, especially to metallic compounds that were being heated so that they could be forged into something. And it turned out that if you added fluorine to these metallic, these high temperature metallic compounds, it would reduce their melting point. And so fluorine was so called because it would help metal flow easier, literally. Again, just like with hydrogen, we can see that fluorine does a lot more than reducing the melting point of other elements and compounds, but it just so happens that this is the name that it got because of that particular property, and then that name ultimately stuck. When you use fluorine compounds on your teeth, for instance, hopefully you are not making them flow easier. That would be destructive, but nonetheless, that is the name of the element to this day. What about neon? This one is particularly interesting and frankly particularly generic. Neon just comes from the ancient Greek word neon, which meant new. If you think it looks like the word new, that's because it's the same root going all the way back to Indo-European. So really, all neon means is the new element or the newly discovered element. Again, this was appropriate, right in the very year that it was discovered, a little bit over 100 years ago. It is no longer the newly discovered element. There have been many, many elements that have been discovered or isolated since then, but the name stuck, and we call it the new element because at one point, that was a particular property that it was known for. How about phosphorus? This one is particularly interesting. Phosphorus comes from two Greek words, phos, which means light. This is the photo root, like a photograph is literally a light writing of a particular image. That's where the name comes from. And then phoros, which is a Greek word that means bringer. So when you put those two things together, phosphorus means bringer of light. Why would an element be called bringer of light? Well, one of the very early properties that was noted about phosphorus when it was isolated was that it catches on fire very easily. It's very flammable, and of course we know fire is always creating light, right? So these early scientists, relatively early scientists, named phosphorus bringer of light because it was just so easily so good at catching fire, essentially. There's another interesting thing to talk about phosphorus, because this word, or this compound, this ancient Greek compound, was already in use thousands of years ago in the ancient Greek language, but it didn't mean the element phosphorus. It was actually used for the morning star. The morning star, which we usually today call Venus. We know it's a planet and not a star. I have a whole other series on planets, so you can go look that up as well, and I'll put a link up here to that. The morning star appears right before the sun rises, and so many ancient cultures called it something like the light-bringing star, because it kind of seemed like it was bringing the sun up with it. It would appear first, and then the sun would appear. The sun would rise, a few minutes or half an hour or something like that later. So the morning star, what we would today call Venus, was very early on called the light-bringing star in many cultures. So the ancient Greeks would oftentimes call Venus Phosphorus, Phosphoros, the light-bringing star. In Latin, just the regular Latin compound that meant light bringer was lucifer. The luc root means light, and the fer root, which is actually cognate with phoros in Greek, means the bringer. So lucifer was the ancient Roman or Latin name for this particular star, the morning star, aka the planet Venus. Now, you're probably looking at this and wondering, wait a minute, I thought Lucifer was something totally different than the planet Venus. We usually use it today as another name for Satan. That's a whole nother story that we don't really have time to get into right now, but I think this would be an interesting thing to talk about in a future episode when we talk about where some of these names, like Lucifer and even Satan, and honestly many other things from ancient religions, come from, because I can promise you there are some pretty good stories behind some of these names, including how the ancient Latin word lucifer, which just meant the morning star, came to be a word that we associate with pure evil today. So maybe I'll tell that story in a later episode. Okay, what about another element that has something to do with, it's got its name from some particular property? Sulfur, which is right next to phosphorus on the periodic table, is another good example of this. The word sulfur just comes from the ancient Latin word sulfur. Originally, it was written with a P. Then they started writing it with a PH to make it look more Greek. The Romans would do this sometimes. And then ultimately, they came to pronounce that PH as an F in Latin, which is why sometimes even today you see sulfur pronounced, or rather written, either with a PH or an F. We usually pronounce it with an F, but we can write it either of those two different ways. But the oldest Latin form is super, pronounced with a P and not an F. What did this mean in Latin? It had something to do with oiliness or burning, and of course those two things will go together. If something is oily, then it might burn a little bit easier. So really all this word means, going all the way back to Latin, was the element that burns. It's the burning element, which again makes sense because it shares a lot of properties with phosphorus because it's right next to phosphorus on the periodic table. These are both elements that burn very easily. The older name for this element in the English language, going back to Old English, was brimstone, and the brim part comes from the burn root. So brimstone actually just means burnstone, or the burning stone. It's a rock that burns. That's essentially all sulfur is. Again, today we associate brimstone with a very specific thing, often from the Bible. Stories like Sodom and Gomorrah in the book of Genesis, where God rains down fire and brimstone onto these cities. And today we use the word sulfur for the actual element. But when they said brimstone, they actually meant sulfur. And so honestly, you could translate that fire and sulfur in the Bible if you really wanted to. How about another element that was named for some particular property that it had? Chlorine. Chlorine, this one is pretty simple. It comes from the Greek word chloron, which was just a color word. It meant something like yellow-green. It was kind of a yellow-green color. It was often a plant color. Plants would oftentimes be described with this particular color adjective in ancient Greek. It could mean pale as well, and so sometimes this word means pale. It's not necessarily a really vibrant green plant color. It's more of a pale yellow-green kind of plant color. Anyways, when this element was isolated, scientists thought that, it looked yellow-green, which it generally does. And so really, the word chlorine just means the yellow-green element. It's named after one particular property of that element. And honestly, this property makes more sense to name the whole element after than some of the other ones we have seen. What about argon? This one is particularly interesting. Argon just comes from the ancient Greek word argon, which meant lazy or inactive or laying around and not doing anything. That's essentially what argon meant in ancient Greek. So why would they name a whole element lazy? It's the lazy element. That doesn't sound like much of a compliment. But if you know your periodic table, you know that argon is one of the noble gases. It does not really combine with other elements. It is standoffish, and it doesn't really interact with them. And so you can see that this is actually a pretty good name for one of the noble gases. Of course, you could have named any of the noble gases argon because they're all pretty lazy and they're all pretty inactive, but this is the one that got the name. And finally, as we're talking about elements that come from some particular property, there's chromium. Chromium comes from the ancient Greek word chroma, which just meant color, essentially. And the reason it got this name is because it often is intensely colored, or it appears in intensely colored compounds. And these could be many colors if you read up on it, but today we associate it with like a brightly lustered silver color. So when we talk about chrome, we usually mean something very shiny that looks kind of silvery. But originally, the name referred to a whole spectrum of colors, and that is how this element got its name. Okay, now that we've gone through those 8 elements that get their name from some particular property, whether an important property or maybe a less important property, let's talk about those 14 elements that get their name from some particular source, the source that they were particularly isolated from or noticed in for the first time. Helium is a good place to start because you probably know that helium comes from the sun. It comes from the ancient Greek word helios, which means sun. There isn't actually that much helium on planet Earth, and so it was first noticed when people were watching a solar eclipse in the past couple hundred years. And so it was quite reasonably given the name helium, the element that is found in the sun. Not all of these are going to be quite that reasonable. The next one is particularly generic. That is lithium, which is just the next element on the periodic table after helium. Lithium got its name from the Greek word lithos, that just means rock. It's a very generic word. So lithium really just means the element that is found in rocks. Now, that is accurate as far as it goes because lithium was first isolated from compounds that were found in certain rocks or minerals. But then again, lots of elements are found in certain rocks or minerals. So this is a very generic name that lithium was given. Again, not inaccurate. It just seems like maybe they could have found a better name. But I guess, who am I to criticize? I am not an elemental scientist. So, when you discover the element, I guess you get to name it, right? How about the next one? Beryllium. This one's going to be a little bit more specific. Beryllium just comes from the ancient Greek word beryllos, which just meant barrel. We just get the word beryl, which is a particular kind of gemstone, from this ancient Greek word. But the ancient Greek word was probably itself a borrowing all the way from the east to what would have been, in ancient Greek or ancient Greece, the end of the world for them, which was India. We think that this actually came from some of the dialects of ancient India, maybe about 2,500 years ago. These dialects were called Prakrits. There were multiple Prakrits, not just one, but we think that this word beryl actually comes from a particular dialect of Prakrit in India, spoken maybe around 2,500 years ago. So beryllium actually ultimately the name comes from the Indian subcontinent, maybe because many beryls were in antiquity sourced from the Indian subcontinent. So when beryllium was named, it was isolated from the gemstone beryl, and so it kind of made sense that they would just name it the element that is found in barrels, because they didn't have anything better to go with. Kind of a similar thing going on with the next element here on the periodic table, which was boron. Boron, the word boron today comes from the medieval Latin word borax, which we would today pronounce borax. And this was probably a loan from Arabic, and that ultimately probably came from Persian, because a lot of borax was sourced from Central Asia, which would have been adjacent to Persian-speaking areas. So really all boron means is the element that is found in borax, because it was first isolated from this particular compound that we call borax. What about carbon? We talk about carbon all the time. This is one of the elements that we talk about the most, along with a handful of others. And of course, our bodies are made up of carbon, so it's nice to know where the word carbon comes from. It's actually pretty simple. It comes from the ancient Latin word carbo, which just meant coal, because it's the element that's found in coal. Once again, carbon is found lots of places. You and I are not made up of coal, but we are made up of carbon. But you can see why coal would have been one of the primary sources that people would have isolated carbon from, especially in the beginning when they were trying to isolate it from specific compounds out there in nature. So carbon really just means the coal element. It's the element that comes from coal. Pretty cool once you know about that. What about nitrogen? The next two here, nitrogen and, spoiler alert, oxygen, those are the next two we're going to be talking about here, all have this gen morpheme at the end, which is the same gen morpheme that we saw with hydrogen. I put hydrogen in the category of elements that were named after a particular property, because hydrogen was named after the property of giving birth to water when it was burned. I put nitrogen and oxygen here in this category because I think the emphasis is a little bit different. I think the gen is saying something more about their source and not necessarily about a property, but I will admit that this is on the borderline, and I think you could put nitrogen and oxygen in either of the categories. So feel free to argue for either one, and I won't necessarily dispute it. Either way, let's talk about where nitrogen comes from. The nitro part comes from the ancient Greek word nitron, which basically meant sodium carbonate or niter, but not necessarily in the modern sense of that word. It really meant sodium carbonate or some kind of soda, baking soda, something we would call soda. We're going to get to that word here in a second. And then, of course, it had this gen root there at the end. The reason it was called this and named this in the past couple hundred years is because it was the element and is the element that comes out of niter, also called saltpeter, when it is reduced to its constituent elements. In other words, nitrogen is one of the elements in the compound saltpeter. The interesting thing is, if you go back to that ancient Greek word, it didn't actually mean saltpeter, and sodium carbonate doesn't have any nitrogen in it in the first place. You can see by the name it's made up of two elements, sodium and carbon, mostly, all right? So nitrogen is really referring to a specific use of the word niter today, not necessarily that ancient Greek root, which, again, we will be talking about a little bit more here going forward, because it is going to come up in another element. But nonetheless, that is where nitrogen, our word today, comes from. And what about oxygen? Why did oxygen get the name that it got? It comes from this other Greek root, oxy, oxus is how they would have pronounced it in classical Greek, which means sharp. It can mean bitter. And then if it's a particular substance, it can mean acidic, because something that's acidic is sharp or bitter if you get it on you or taste it or whatever, right? So oxygen essentially means the element that comes out of acid, the element that comes out of something that is sharp or bitter or acidic when it is reduced to its constituent elements. It was named this because it was thought by its namer about 250 years ago that all acids had oxygen as one of their components. We know today that that's not the case, but the name oxygen ultimately stuck, even though we know that it is no longer quite applicable to this element. And again, we know that oxygen does many other things beside, form a constituent of many acids to begin with. So it's another element that if we could go back and maybe revise the names, maybe we would change it. But obviously, it's way too late to change this element's name. We all just call it oxygen. We breathe it in every second, every minute, and we need it to survive. But it's interesting to see where the name came from. What about sodium? I told you we were going to get to another element that we would get to talk a little bit more about some of those words that we were just talking about on the nitrogen slide. So how about sodium? The word sodium comes from the Latin word soda, which just meant sodium carbonate of some kind. In other words, we're talking about baking soda or something like that. If you're wondering about the modern use of the word soda, I don't know about you, but most of the time when I say soda, at least in my dialect of English, I'm talking about Coca-Cola, I'm talking about Pepsi, I'm talking about a soft drink. Some people call this, different things in different parts of the English-speaking world, but soda is certainly in the United States one of the more common things that we call it. The reason we call this drink soda is because originally the carbonation, notice carbonation has the word carbon in it, the carbonation was provided by some kind of sodium carbonate that was forced into it to create bubbles. Even though that's no longer how the bubbles are created, there's no sodium or carbonate in the carbonation any longer, as far as I know. It's certainly not soda, baking soda of any kind like that. We still call it soda, and that name ultimately stuck. But the original name of soda, going back way before soft drinks or fizzy beverages came about, had nothing to do with that kind of drink. It was a particular kind of sodium carbonate, again, like baking soda. So think of that kind of soda when we're talking about this word soda. So sodium basically just got its name from being the element that's found in baking soda. Sodium is one of the important elements in there, and so this element was able to be isolated from that compound. Baking soda, washing soda, one of these other kinds of sodas. Now, this element has an interesting fact about it, as you probably know, and that is that its symbol, Na, doesn't look anything like its name in English. That's because the symbol stands for another word, a related word, and that word is natrium, which is a made-up modern Latin word. They didn't have this word in ancient Latin, but it's a made-up modern Latin word, natrium, that comes from this same Greek word nitrone that we talked about with nitrogen, okay? Because remember, that word nitrone in Greek actually did mean something like sodium carbonate. It wasn't actually saltpeter like in the element nitrogen. So it's actually more accurate to call sodium nitrogen than it is to call nitrogen, but I digress. So it comes from this ancient Greek root, but the Greeks did not make up this word because it probably ultimately came from the Egyptian word natrone. You can see it's pretty similar to the Greek word there because sodium carbonate was oftentimes sourced from dry lake beds in Egypt, basically endorheic basins where water would flow in and not flow out in some kind of depression, oftentimes below sea level in Egypt, not right near the Nile River, and then the water would evaporate and leave a crusty lake bed that was made up of salt and other sodium products. And so that's actually where the word ultimately comes from. That niter word comes from an Egyptian word from thousands of years ago, and the symbol Na ultimately comes from that as well. Let's talk about two elements that are kind of twins on the periodic table. You may have noticed that these two elements, magnesium and manganese, look very similar to each other. Why do they look so similar? Is that an accident? As it turns out, it's not an accident. They both have the same etymology, and they both come from a particular region of ancient Greece, what would now be central or north-central Greece, northwest of Athens, in the ancient region of Thessaly. There was an area called Magnesia that was named after a particular tribe called the Magnetes. They then, or some of them at least, colonized a section of what is now western Turkey on the coast, and so there were two Magnesias, one one in modern-day Greece, one in modern-day Turkey, and it could have referred, Magnesia could have referred to either of those. These two regions of Magnesia were known for certain ores and compounds that could be sourced from the earth in those particular areas, and as it turns out, both of these names, through a very long and convoluted path, they get their name from those two areas of what is now Greece and Turkey, those two Magnesian regions over there in that part of the world. Again, I'm not going to go too in-depth into the story because it is pretty complicated, but by all means look it up if you're interested, because I think it is a pretty cool story to talk about. What about aluminum, or if you are part of the English-speaking world outside of North America, aluminium? Of course, that's the same element, and it comes from the same source. That source is the Latin word alumen, which just meant alum or some other kind of bitter salt. And so you probably won't be surprised to know that aluminum, or aluminium, just means the element that is found in alum. That's essentially all it is. That was the source that it was originally gotten from. Again, we can get this element from other places now, but that was a well-known compound going all the way back to antiquity. Even before the element was isolated, there was something about that particular compound that made it very famous, and that's ultimately where the element was isolated from. Sort of similar story with silicon or silicon. This comes from an ancient Latin word, silex, silicus, the root is silic there that I put. It could be a generic word that meant like a flint or a pebble or a rock or a stone or something like that, but it could also mean silica, which is of course a particular compound that contains the element silicon. So when the element silicon was isolated, it was isolated primarily from the compound silica, and it just took its name directly from the compound silica. Makes sense, right? What about potassium? This one is particularly interesting because we've been seeing with all of these elements that we've been looking at that they really have almost all been coming from ancient Greek or Latin, even if Greek and Latin got those words from some other source like Egyptian or Persian or a language of the Indian subcontinent. This is an element that actually doesn't get its name from ancient Greek or Latin. It comes from two pretty native English words, pot and ash, and you just put those together and you get basically a pot that you put ashes in. That's actually where the compound potash comes from. You would put ashes from burnt plants in a pot, you might mix them with water, and that was a very early way of isolating the element potassium, which is of course a very important element for life and the maintenance thereof. By the way, I do know that the word pot may ultimately come from Latin 2,000 years ago, but let's not be too pedantic here. This is a pretty native English word that's been in English since English was on the continent. In other words, when the speakers of Old English or Proto-Old English crossed the English Channel to colonize England, they probably already had this word. So it goes back a long, long way. So potassium just comes from this particular source, potash, that it was oftentimes originally sourced from. This is another element where the symbol, the K there, doesn't look like it's connected to the word in English at all. And just like last time, that's because it's from another word, another name for this element that is used in some languages, and that is kalium. That starts with a K, and that's where the K in potassium comes from. Where does kalium come from? Interestingly, kalium comes from the word alkali, which we have in English. It's the opposite of acid or acidic. If something's not acidic, it's alkaline or basic. And as it turns out, potash is a basic thing. It's a basic compound. It's alkaline. Alkali, in turn, actually comes from an Arabic word, alkalia, with the Q there. And we've talked about what the Q would be when we were talking about the alphabet. So this is like a stop that's further back in the mouth than a regular K, all right? So alkalia just means plant ashes in Arabic, and it's where our word alkali comes from. The al in Arabic is just the definite article, so you can chop it off and just get kalia or kalium, which is the name of the element, as I said, in some languages today, and also where the K that stands for potassium is derived. So again, when you know that, it kind of makes sense and you can remember what's going on with that particular symbol. What about calcium? One more source here. This comes from the Latin word calx, that meant limestone. I don't mean lime like the modern tropical fruit. I mean lime like limestone, or the powder that you could make things out of. That's the lime that we are talking about here. So really, All calcium means is it's the element that is found in lime or limestone. Once again, a famous compound that has been known for several thousand years, even before the element was isolated from it. And so rather than naming the compound after the element, we name the element after the compound. It's just a very famous source for this particular element. Again, we know this element is very important to our bodies and to our health and to everything else, but it is named after a particular kind of stone or powder ultimately. All right, so we talked about all of the elements that are getting their name from some particular compound that they were isolated from. Let's talk about the one element that is named after a particular region or area, and that is Scandium. It comes from the Latin word Scandia, which just means Scandinavia. So all Scandium means is it's the element from Scandinavia. As we go on in the periodic table, we're going to see a lot more of these. It's interesting that we only get one of these in the first 25 basic elements that we have been looking at. And then the two elements that are named after some kind of mythological beings of some kind that are in the first 25. One of them is titanium. This comes from the ancient Greek word for the Titans. You may have known that. And so it really just means the element that is as strong as the Titans were, which if you think about it, the Titans got overthrown by the Olympians. So maybe they should have named this Olympium instead of titanium because that would have made it sound stronger. But once again, who am I to criticize? I didn't discover the element. And then finally, vanadium comes from the ancient Norse goddess Vanadis, which is just another name for Freya. She was the goddess of beauty, among other things. And so it seems like this element was named as a testament or homage to its beauty or its luster. It's the element that is as beautiful as the goddess Freya. Isn't that nice? Isn't that a touching name? So that's all 25 of the first elements. As you can see, they divide up pretty nicely, and there's a lot of great stories to tell there about where those names come from. Stay tuned for part 2, and we will talk about the names of more elements then.